Okay, so good morning, everybody. We've got this concept in halacha as far as Hilchos tzedakah that you qualify as an ani is if you don't have 200 zuz, which was considered to be the amount that you needed in order to live for a year. So provided that a person doesn't have enough money to sustain himself for a year, then he's considered to be an ani and he's permitted to take tzedakah. But that's only, like we said, if he's not drawing a regular salary. A lot of people don't have enough savings to last them for a full year. They live from month to month. But if you're getting a regular salary, so then you don't qualify as an ani. But using that number as our criterion, that as long as you don't have enough to live out the year, you're allowed to collect tzedakah, we have the next halacha. Ani shekibel tzedakah v'yesh lo ata reish zuz eno rashai lakachat yoter. An ani goes collecting, and lo and behold, he gets really, really successful. In other words, as far as his collections go, he's done quite well for himself. And so once he hits 200 zuz, he's got to stop. In other words, he can't keep. He's got his world tour, and so he hit the United States, went to different states, and on his way to Canada, and he counts his money, and he realizes, hey, I already hit my goal. So he's not allowed to continue on to Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver just because he's got tickets, He's got to stop at that point. What's the definition of 200 zuz? The amount that you need to live for a full year. Once you've hit your goal, or let's say you're making a wedding and you've hit your goal of how much you need to make, ginuk, you can't say, well, I'm on a roll, let me keep on going. Ulam im yesh la'ani reish zuz chaser dinar, afilu nostim lo elef zuz bevat echat harei ze yitol. But if he hasn't hit his goal yet, even if he's just $1 short, and the next guy he goes to is very wealthy and it offers him $1,000 check, he's allowed to accept it. But whatever he collects above and beyond the 200 zuz, he should use for charity purposes. That's what he says. Now he's quoting a sefer called Derech Emunah, and he explains as follows. He says, "Demash shekosab b'shulchan aruch, the im yesh la'ani reish zuz chaser dinar." He says, because even though the Shulchan Aruch does acknowledge that if you even are short $1, afilu notnim lo elav zuz bevat achat harei ze yitol, that even then if you get a check for $1,000 or $10,000, you're allowed to take it. Hainu shemutar lo litol afilu l'shana haba'a u'lishanim sheyavou. That means that it's permitted for him to take for the following year or for future years. But if he has no use for it at all, which no one's going to tell you, I have no use for it. Of course you have a use for it. So then it's usher for him to take it. Because the definition of tzedakah is take what you're lacking. But once you no longer lack, because you've really succeeded, so then you're not allowed to take anymore. And so therefore, if you reach a surplus, you should strive to use that surplus money for tzedakah purposes. Now, it's a little bit vague, okay, but that's, at least we know that there's an upper limit as to how much you're allowed to collect. I guess for a yeshiva, this doesn't count if you're collecting for a yeshiva. But if you're collecting for yourself, for your family, once you hit your goal, you should pack up and get back to where you came from. Okay. Misha holech mi beito v'nosea me'ir le'ir lekabetz tzedakah. So a person is a traveler. He's an itinerant charity collector. Goes from city to city and collects tzedakah. Isn't there a song called Wanderer, right? Well, I go from town to town, collect. Okay. Anyway, a guy goes from house. Yeah. So a guy leaves his home and he goes from city to city to collect tzedakah. Kol haderech shahaya b'daito linsoa kishalach mi beito begeder pam echat. He says, the entire travel itinerary that he had originally planned is considered to be under the rubric of accepting tzedakah one time. In other words, we just saw a halacha that if someone gives you a gift of $10,000 in one shot, even if you're just $1 short of your goal, you're allowed to accept all of it. He says, if you have an itinerary all set out, then you're allowed to follow through with your itinerary. So therefore, he says, contrary to the example that I had given, he says, even if you've already met your goal in one city, you're allowed to follow through on your travels and to continue collecting. Provided that you use the money, the surplus money, for tzedakah purposes. So it's actually from the Ramah. Similarly, if someone's making a chasana for his daughter, and he goes to Chutz La'aretz, this is like a handbook for shluchei mitzvah who are going out to collect tzedakah. He says, if you're going to collect tzedakah in Chutz La'aretz in order to collect enough money to marry off your daughter, gam imasaf maspik lamatarato, even if you've already met your goal, yachol lahamshich v'lesof ad sheyigmor nesiato, you're permitted to finish your trip. In other words, you're permitted to fulfill your full itinerary. And as a matter of fact, isn't there like a special airline ticket in Israel that you can buy in Israel that lets you go from city to city for one price? I think that's how it works. Shekol otan nesiya b'chul nechshevet pam echat. He says because the entire trip to Chutz La'aretz is considered to be one trip. Ach yishtamesh bekesef hanotar l'nisuei sha'ar yiladav. But you should use that surplus that you collect for marrying off your additional children. In other words, put it aside. Don't use it to go on vacation. Don't use it to buy yourself a nice car, but rather you have to use that money for this purpose that it was collected for. Okay. Now, Misha ein lo kesef l'shalem chovotav. If a person doesn't have enough money to pay off debt, yesh poskim shechayav la'avod kidei l'shalem. So some say that he's obligated to work until he can pay off the debt. That's what a regular person would do. The person is in debt. He continues working until he can pay off the debt. Aval ein lebeitin koach lechafoto la'avod. But the Beis Din can't force a person to work. So a guy goes to Beis Din and he loses the case, and the Beis Din says, "Okay, you owe money. You have to pay." But what if the guy says, "Well, I don't make enough money to pay off the debt"? The Beis Din will have to work out some kind of payment plan and say, "Continue working until you can pay it off." How can we force a person to work? No, we can't force a person to work. V'yesh cholkin v'sovrim she'eno chayav la'avod, and there are poskim who say that we can't that a person is not obligated to work harder to pay off a debt if he's getting by on whatever living he has, and if he were to work harder, he'd be able to pay off the debt. He's not obligated to work harder in order to pay off the debt. Ulam im yesh lo avoda shu ragil hitparnes mimena lechol hadeot, yesh lebeitin lekoach lechafoto laavod ba kedei l'shalem et chovotav. But if a person has a certain skill that he's capable of working, and he just doesn't want to work, so then everyone agrees that Beis Din can order him to go back to work and to pay off his debts. So, in other words, what does this have to do with Hilchos tzedakah? A person does not have a right to go and collect tzedakah to pay off debts if he's capable of working in order to be able to pay off those debts. obviously within reason. Everyone's capable of working extra hours, but there does become a limit where a person stretches too far and can compromise his physical health, right? Okay. Misha chayav kesef ve'en lo l'shalem eno chayav l'chayzer al ha'ptachim kedei lifroa chavotav. If a person is in debt and he doesn't have enough money to pay off the debt, he's not obligated to become a beggar in order to pay off the debt. V'yesh misha posek shemisha shebelav hachim mechazer al ptachim kedei lafarnes beito chayav lechazer gam kedei lahachzir et chovotav aval ein kofen oto. And there's an opinion, however, that says that if you are already a mishulach or a beggar, and you're already going from place to place to feed your family, then you have to basically do the same in order to pay off your debts. So a person is in debt. Obviously, the Torah holds that whatever money you owe, you have to pay back. But you're not mechuyev to become a beggar in order to pay off debt, unless it's that story of the mafia that I told you of, in which case it's not just a question of paying off a debt, it's a question of saving your life. And that's why the poskim that he had collected, the rabbis whose names he had collected as endorsers, felt it was important to support him because his life was in danger. But in a regular case where a person's in debt, he's not mechuyev to collect, to beg for it. But if he's already begging for his family, and that's sort of like what he's used to doing, so then he is obligated to go ahead and collect and beg more in order to pay off his debts. Misha mekabel temicha mikaspei hatzdaka. If a person is living off of tzedakah funds, kofim oto lichyot im bnei beito bedochak kidei l'shalem et chovotav bekesef ha'odei. So he's obligated to pay off his debts and live with greater limitations. In other words, if you're already accepting tzedakah money, because let's say the school is putting you on scholarship or something like that, and then you also additionally have debt, you're mechuyev to live with an absolute minimum of a living standard in order to be able to get some kind of surplus to pay off that debt. You can't say, well, these are my living expenses and I don't have any money left at the end of the month. But one second, you're living off of you're already accepting tzedakah, so you're mechuyev to pare down your living standards to the bare minimum so that you can pay back your debt. Mishi yachol l'shalem chovotav eino patur mila'aser et hakesef shemimenu mishalem et hachovot. If a person is in the midst of paying off a debt, that does not exempt him from giving tzedakah. So if he's making a living, and part of the money that he's making a living from, he's using to service the debt, he's using to pay off the debt, he can't say, well, that exempts me from tithes. I still have to tithe my money. Okay, to the best of my ability, obviously. So he's quoting from Rav Kanievsky, who writes that Shalosh Shama Heter Lemishi Yesh Lo Chovot Shelo Yitztarech Latet Maaser Mehakesef Sheparei Chovo. He says, I never heard that a person would not be obligated to tithe the money that he makes, that he's using to pay back a debt. That's still income, and you still have to tithe that. Well, I think we saw before that if a person lives in absolute squalor, he simply doesn't have enough money to cover his expenses. He doesn't have to give meiser. He's still chayiv in tzedakah, but he doesn't have to take a full 10%. Okay. Misha machzir chovotav umashir la'atzmo rak et hamuchrach biyoter patur milatet ma'aser. And that's actually the next halacha. If a person is in the process of paying back his debts and he leaves only the bare minimum for himself, for his living expenses, so then he doesn't have to give ma'aser. V'yesh misha posek shemikol makom et sukuma ma'aser yirshom la'atzmo kechov v'yifra achar sheyishalem et kol chovotav. And some say that he should do as follows. He makes, let's say, he makes a livable salary. Usually at the end of the month, he has a little bit of wiggle room that he would normally take meiser from. But because he's in the midst of paying back a debt, he literally has nothing at the end of the month to say that he's got any money left for tzedakah, and he's living at the bare minimum. So the first opinion is that he's totally putter. The second opinion is that write down how much you normally would have tithed if you were not paying back your debt, and keep it as sort of a future, like memo for your future self that you owe this money to tzedakah at some point in the future. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Yesh misha posek shim al yedei nitinat ma'aser eino omeid b'tanai hachazer chovotav eino noheg kira'oi. There is a psak that if by giving tzedakah, if by giving your regular tithes, you're not able to pay back your debt properly, then you're not acting correctly. In other words, what takes priority, giving tzedakah or paying back the money that you owe? So the answer is, and he quotes Rav Osner, he says, and he quotes him in the footnote, he says, V'zeh pashut etzli, shekol adam shehu bal chov la'acherim. He says, it is obvious to me, says Rav Osner, that anyone who is in debt to other people, but because he feels he needs to give meiser, he's going to diminish the amount that he owes on a regular basis. Lo tov oseh ba'amav ad kam lashana. He's not acting properly among his people. He says, in other words, let's say he made a deal with a creditor that I'm going to pay you back $100 a month until the debt is already paid off. And he goes to his friend and he says, I'm sorry, I couldn't give you the $100 this month. They asked me to go to the such and such dinner. I had to go to the dinner. So I had to give them $100 to go to the dinner. So that's not an excuse. What? So you're not going to pay me what you owe me because you had to go to a charity dinner? What is this, man? Right? That's what Rav Osner is talking about. A person can't excuse himself from servicing a debt just because he needed that money to go to give to tzedakah. It's not a legitimate excuse. The first priority is to pay what you owe to other people. Right. Mm-hmm.
Not proportionate to what they are as a regular money for collecting money. Are you obligated to give a shul fund, give them money?
So you're saying like someone within our
So
community
will come to you, for example, and ask you, they're making a wedding, but they'll give them to the Torah fund. And then you see them giving stuff to other places that are not to the shul, something else. And they could have used that money for the wedding and they're giving stuff to another institution.
Yeah,
So
that's
and they don't have to pay back. You don't have to pay back the money that you're giving them for Torah. You're giving them
right.
a check saying, here, Mama, it's okay, here's $5, whatever it is. Then you see them giving money to other places. What obligation are you to give them for their wedding when they're giving stuff at other places?
Well,
They're taking it to make the wedding, but they're still giving the stuff to other places.
well, listen, a person still has a right to tithe when he's making a living. So let's say a guy is making a salary and he makes 50 grand a year. He has enough to get by. He even has enough to tithe his income to give, let's say, a couple grand a year after taxes he gives to charity. And then all of a sudden he's hit with this bill. He needs to come up with $10,000 to make a wedding for his daughter, right? Which isn't an exorbitant amount. It's probably, uh, probably, you know, would be a modest wedding, right? Let's say. So am I obligated to give that fellow money from the charity fund just because he's giving tzedakah? Yeah, I think so. I think that would be justifiable, right? Can I?
Back to the place that gave him stuff to make the wedding?
Well, I think anyone with a sense of gratitude would say, you know, I know that this is coming from the shul's tzedakah fund, so let me use let me use a large share of my charity for this year and give it to the shul's tzedakah fund, so I can replenish the fund, right? But not everyone thinks that way, Moish. I guess not. Yeah. Okay. When you become president. Yeah. Siman Yudalit, Shelo lekabel tzedakah migoy umimumar. Now, this is going to be a very controversial chapter because it's the halachas of not accepting charity from a Gentile and from a mumar, who is a Jew who has become an apostate, right? Who has turned away from his faith. So, asur litol tzedakah min hagoyim b'farhesia bishvil aniyim mishum chilul Hashem. It is forbidden to accept charity from Gentiles publicly for the poor because of a chilul Hashem, because this creates a desecration. Now, this is really fascinating because I'm on the board of a charity that its primary donors are Christians. And they want to give tzedakah specifically for poor Jews in the former Soviet Union and in Israel, because this is how they feel that they become part of the chosen people. So the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to do that. So we're going to have to see some qualifications. Apparently, like what he's going to say, aval bitzina mutar bitnai she'en kavanatam latet liYisrael davka. Privately, you are allowed to collect tzedakah from non-Jews, provided that it's not their intention to davka support Jews. Aval im kavanatan latet liYisrael davka, but if their intent is to give dafka to Jews, which is clearly the case in this charity, because that's their whole objective is they view this as they view it as a mitzvah to support the chosen people. Afilu bitzina asur. So then even to do it privately is asur. Dichtiv biyavosh kitzira tishabarna. So that Hainu kishetichle zuchut hatzedakah shel hagayim az yishaberu. That because the pasuk says that when the kitzira, the heart, well, that's really what harvest means, but here it probably means the tithing dries up, then they will break. In other words, we want the goyim to break. So the only way the goyim will break is if they stop giving tzedakah. But if they still have the zuchus of tzedakah, they'll never break. And so therefore, we want those shlechte goyim to break. How can we allow them to have the zuchus of giving us tzedakah? We won't accomplish our goal of having those shlechte goyim break. Right? That's the argument of the Shulchan Aruch. So that's the whole question. How do we understand this halacha? So first of all, you think? I mean, it's really, really hard to quantify this halacha, but just like so many of our other halachas, this is Reish Nun Dalid. Just give me one second. Reish Nun 254. Seriously?
That's what I'm saying, is the Aruch HaShulchan say something different.
Hold on.
His name is on the bill.
His name is,
Romano Romanovich.
I thought Romano was the name of the neighborhood. No, Romano. Really? Isn't that interesting? Okay. Romano. Okay. Okay. So, umikol makom, im eno yachol lichyot b'tzedakah shel Yisrael, yitol mehem b'tzina. So the Aruch HaShulchan quotes the exact same thing, quotes the exact same pasuk, and he says, therefore, even to accept from them privately will be usher, but if there's not enough Jewish money, and the only way to survive is with non-Jewish money, then you're allowed to accept privately, and even publicly if there's no way to accept it privately because he wants the plaque. B'tamo shel davar nir eli, de be'emet ein ze migeder chilul Hashem klal. So the Aruch HaShulchan says the reason for these leniencies is because it seems to me that it's really not a chilul Hashem, ela she'ein ze kavod sheyitztarchu litzdaka shel acherim. He says, but it's not honorable to the Jewish people that they should be reliant on tzedakah. They should be reliant on others for charity. V'gam hadrasha shel yavosh ketzira b'gemara asmachta ba'alma. And therefore he says, and even the pasuk that the Gemara quotes is not to be taken literally, that that's the conveyance of the pasuk. It's an asmachta. In other words, Chazal were concerned about the prestige of the Jewish people. And that I think is a real issue. In other words, if this causes a reduction of prestige for the Jewish people, because we're made to look like the Nebachs of the world, so then it's not proper to collect tzedakah publicly, because it makes the Jewish people look bad. And therefore, if there's no other option, and this is the only way that you can support these people, so then it is permissible. And then he quotes, he says, V'yesh mi sherotzeh lechalek ben yachid l'rabim. There is an opinion that says maybe you could make a distinction between collecting on behalf of one person versus collecting for a whole public entity, that you would be allowed to collect for a private individual. Ve'ein svar klal lechalek bazeh. But there's no basis to make such a distinction. But then he says, Adam chashuv mehem, sheshalach tzedakah liyisrael lechalkam la'aniyim, ein machzirim lahem. If a very important person from among the Gentiles sends charity for a Jewish charity, and he says, I want you to give this to tzedakah, you can't refuse the gift. You can't say, no, we're not accepting it. Even though there may not even be a great need, because we can take care of ourselves. We have enough money within the community to take care of the poor. But if a person who's a non-Jew wants to participate, so then you can't turn him away. And the reason is because of Darkei Shalom. Because you want to preserve peace, like it's going to create animosity if you refuse charity. Ella notlin mimenu, and therefore you're allowed to accept it. The kaven sha'aniyim einam muchrachim lazeh yichalakeim la'aniyehem b'seiter, and sha'aniyenu einam muchrachim lazeh, and if indeed the Jewish poor don't need the money, then privately you can distribute whatever you don't need for the Jewish poor to the Gentile poor. V'yesh omrim di'im shalach stam ya'asu kain, and there is an opinion that says that if the guy made a donation to a Jewish charity, like a Jewish benevolent fund. And he didn't say specifically, I want you to give this to your fellow Hebrews, right? He just says, I want to give a gift to your favorite charity, right? So then you're allowed to accept it. Aval, and then you should distribute it to the poor, to the Gentile, for a Gentile charity cause. Aval im shalach meforash la'aniyeh Yisrael, asur l'shanot midat hanotein. But if he says, if he says beferish, I want this to go to support Jews, then you're obligated to support Jews with it. We'll continue this in